Walsh. I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I've been doing psychotherapy for the last 37 years, and this series is called Care of the Self. We have been talking about chronic emotional states or other chronic problem states and finding ways to resolve those states. We discussed already that there are typically three common sources of these chronic states. One source is an event or events from the past that have not been resolved that trigger the state in the present. We addressed that in the last sequence. In this sequence, we're going to talk about belief, because belief can be a powerful driver of these chronic states. And so, the belief doesn't have to be known to you consciously. It may be something that was developed in kindergarten or who knows when, but the belief continues to have its effect. So what you can do first, of course, is develop the signaling system with the unconscious through your fingers, so that one finger lifts up as a yes response from the unconscious, a different finger lifts up as a no response from the unconscious, and that was all defined in a previous segment. So once you have that signaling system, you can ask, is the source of this chronic anxiety or depression related to a belief from the past? Patiently await a response. The unconscious is going to conduct a search. And if your yes finger lifts up, then you can say, I'd like to talk to all parts that carry this belief. Because a belief is only valid if it fits with current inner reality. And inner reality is changing all the time because we're always adding things to it. And when a belief no longer fits with inner reality, it's always best to let go of that belief before it creates problems for the whole system. And then I'll ask, are the parts that carry this belief familiar with the reality of 2024 in this case, whatever the year is? And patiently await a response. If you get a no response, then it's an indication that probably, young parts are carrying this belief. You can say, I'd like to ask the unconscious to please provide a brief overview of current reality to these parts so they can understand at least some of what's happening in present reality. And when that overview is complete, the yes finger can lift up. Then patiently await that response. It may take a few minutes for that overview to take place. And when the yes finger lifts up, then you can ask, now that these parts have some understanding of current reality, does this belief really fit with current reality? Likely you'll get a no. And then you can ask, for the benefit of the whole system, are these parts willing to let go of this outdated belief? Typically you'll get a yes, and if you do, then you can ask the unconscious, will this belief with all of its thoughts and perceptions now be retired to the past, where it has no influence on the present or the future? If you get a yes, that can happen, and you can ask the yes finger to lift up when this belief is fully retired to the past. And once you get that signal, then you can concern yourself about these parts that are likely isolated parts from the past. They're trapped in the past, in isolation, and of course we'd like to help them out. So typically I will say, concerning all of the parts that let go of this belief, that allowed this belief to be retired to the past, will these parts now be processed out of isolation so they can join the rest of the system in the present. And if you get a yes, then that can happen, and you can ask the yes finger to lift up when these parts are no longer isolated. If you get a no, then you can ask the unconscious, is there something important that needs to be understood before these parts can be processed out of isolation? If you get a no, then you can ask, is there some other belief these parts carry that prevents them from leaving isolation? If you get a yes, then you can follow the same procedure and ask that that belief be retired to the past. And if that happens, once it is retired, you can ask that these parts be processed out of isolation, and that will usually work. Okay, so let's back up a little bit. Let's say you've asked that that belief be retired to the past and you get a no. Then I will ask, is this belief connected to other beliefs, other very similar beliefs that basically say the same thing? And if you get a yes, then I will say I'm going to call this a cluster of beliefs. And this cluster of beliefs is likely outdated as well. Will this cluster of beliefs now be retired to the past, where it has no influence on the present or the future? If you get a yes, then you can ask the yes finger to lift up when this cluster of beliefs is fully retired to the past. And then once again, you're going to try to help these isolated parts out of isolation and integrate them into the present. Let's say that you've asked parts, does this belief really fit current reality? And let's say they say yes. Well, that's a problem. When parts indicate that they find the belief compatible with current reality, I'll ask them if they're familiar with the term self-fulfilling prophecy. And if they are, I'll proceed ahead and explain how the belief is really playing out as a self-fulfilling prophecy, creating problems that don't need to be there. In other words, if the belief was gone, the problem could be gone. And so this is one approach, and quite often when parts realize this, they will agree to let go of that belief, and the belief then can be retired. If parts are not familiar with that term, self-fulfilling prophecy, well, I'll explain how holding a belief is part of inner reality, and inner reality does its best to make outer reality conform to it. And sometimes a belief will create problems, real problems in outer reality that don't need to be there. They're only there because the belief is there. And I'll often share a story of a school-age child who became quite depressed. His parents brought him to me, and he was a very smart child, and he had enjoyed school, did quite well at school. He was a straight A student, and he contracted the flu and was really quite ill, and somehow talked his mother into letting him go to school so he could take a test. And he flunked the test. He had a fever, it was bad. And at that point, he well, he became quite depressed about flunking that test because he knew the answers, but he was ill. And from that point forward, he was flunking every test he took. And when I saw him, I questioned his unconscious, and it turned out that there was a part of him developed when he flunked that test that believed he was going to flunk every test after that. And that belief was, well, making him flunk every test. So we talked this part into letting go of that belief and got that part out of isolation and released all of its emotion. And the belief was no longer playing a role with this kid, and he became a straight A student again. So I explained this to these parts, and then I asked them, for the benefit of the whole system, are you willing to let go of this problematic belief? Typically the parts will say yes, and then we retire the belief to the past and get those parts out of isolation. So that can happen. There may be a single belief, and if the single belief can't be retired to the past, it may be because of its association with a series of other beliefs, which I call a belief cluster. And typically you can retire the whole cluster of beliefs to the past. And then again, help parts that are carrying that belief out of isolation. Many times the parts carrying a belief are not isolated, so you don't need to worry about that. They're parts that exist in the present, but they're carrying a belief from the past that has lingered for a long time. So it's about retiring the belief. Once the belief is retired, then that source of chronic anxiety or depression or something else is resolved. Okay, so this is a way to resolve yet another source of a chronic problem state. And in our next segment, we're going to talk a little bit more about parts, because parts can be involved in yet a third cause or source of chronic problem states. So we'll dive into the whole parts system or ego state system next time. So thank you for watching, and realize that this information can be accessed in the Care of the Self Owner's Manual book. That's easily available. Okay, thanks. I'll see you next time.